My name is Rachel Monroe. I flew combat missions for the Air Force for nearly 2 decades, logged over 3,000 hours, survived 1 crash and 2 deployments that still visit me in my sleep. But none of that ever made it into the family Christmas letters, and it sure didn't earn me a spot on the guest list for my brother's funeral. I arrived just after sunrise, parked 2 blocks down from the chapel, and walked the rest of the way in uniform under a civilian coat. No one noticed. That's how it had always been, me slipping in and out of the family's life like a shadow they never quite acknowledged. The church doors were already open. Rows of black suits and polished shoes filled the pews. There was a printed program in every seat, embossed in gold. His name was on every page. Mine wasn't even in the acknowledgments. They always said I made choices they didn't understand, that my path made it hard for them to relate, but I never asked for applause. I just wanted to matter enough to be included. When my brother Daniel died, it was sudden. Heart attack in his sleep, 44 years old, no warning. The family came together like clockwork, perfect grief in perfect suits, I was told by voicemail. They didn't expect me to come, probably assumed I was too far away, too unreachable. I didn't correct them, I just showed up. Inside, I took a seat in the very back, behind the last row of mourners, near the stained glass window. It was the same church we'd been dragged to as kids. I remembered tracing the cracks in the wooden pews with my fingernail while the sermons went on. I did that now too, out of muscle memory. I saw my parents up front, my father, with his hand resting on my mother's wrist like a punctuation mark. Her face set in stone, eyes dry but dramatic, the kind of sorrow meant to be witnessed. I hadn't seen them in 4 years. The last time was a family wedding I wasn't invited to but attended anyway. That was also the last time we spoke. Briefly, at a distance, like diplomats from estranged countries. They hadn't changed, still wrapped in the world they built for themselves, one where Daniel was the golden son, and I was the cautionary tale they didn't explain to new friends. I listened to the eulogy, stories about Daniel's firm, his charitable giving, and how he coached Little League even after a full week at the office. They called him a leader, a mentor, a pillar. I waited for my name. It never came. No one turned around. No one whispered. I wasn't important enough for scandal or sympathy. I was a ghost in a borrowed pew. But I didn't come to be seen. I came to remember what being invisible felt like, because something had shifted, and soon, the silence they once counted on was going to be broken. The pastor's voice carried through the chapel like a soft command, reverent and practiced. He spoke of Daniel as if he'd been a soldier, a saint, and a CEO all in one. Every sentence was polished, every anecdote curated to present a man who never failed and never faltered. I sat there, listening, knowing full well how carefully that version had been built. Daniel had charm. He had polish. He knew how to say the right thing in front of the right people. That was enough for our parents to crown him before we were even teenagers. My mother wore a tailored navy dress, pearls resting like punctuation against her collarbone. She dabbed her eyes occasionally, but her makeup stayed intact. My father kept his hand on her arm, nodding solemnly as old business partners and neighbors whispered condolences. To them, this was a gallery of grief, and they were the curators. Every gesture rehearsed, every response deliberate. There was no room for raw sorrow here, only display. I watched them stand for the family tribute. My father adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat like he was addressing a boardroom, not mourning a son. He thanked everyone for coming, praised Daniel's career, his family values, and his impact. He ended with, "We were lucky to raise a son who made us proud every single day." Then he sat down, and that was that. No mention of the girl who used to build Lego cities next to Daniel's train sets. No nod to the sister who once pulled him out of a frozen lake when he fell through. My existence wasn't erased. It was simply inconvenient. It had always been that way. Daniel got the new bike, and I got the leftovers. He got private school, I got scholarships. When I enlisted at 17, they told friends I was figuring things out. When Daniel opened his first office, they sent out announcements. At some point, I stopped trying to prove anything. Not out of strength, but because exhaustion feels a lot like acceptance if you sit with it long enough. I stopped sending holiday cards. They stopped noticing. Today was no different, except for the fact that Daniel was gone, and even in death he pulled them all tighter together, like I was the outside ring no one remembered to draw. The organist played something slow and mournful. People dabbed at tears, cleared throats, shifted in their seats. I just stared at the back of my parents' heads and wondered what it would have taken for them to ever say they were proud of me. Maybe if I'd stayed. Married young, settled into something they understood. But that version of me never existed, and they never tried to find the one who did. A woman 2 rows up leaned into my mother and whispered something. My mother smiled faintly and replied, "Daniel always had a sense of purpose. Rachel was more restless." The woman nodded politely. My stomach tightened, but I didn't move. They always used that word, restless, like I was a windstorm that couldn't sit still. Not a woman who carried lives across airspace or helped stabilize wounded pilots in hostile terrain. I stayed in my seat until the recessional began, until the polished casket rolled past and people murmured blessings they barely meant. I didn't join the procession. I didn't step into the sunlit parking lot with the others. I waited, because sometimes the only power you have left is not giving them what they expect. The sound came low at first, a steady rumble that rolled across the chapel roof like distant thunder. People paused mid-step, glancing upward as the windows trembled in their frames. A few shifted uneasily, unsure if it was part of the service or something else entirely. Then it hit. A deafening roar as the military jet streaked overhead, banking hard before dropping altitude fast. The stained glass rattled, and somewhere in the back, a baby started to cry. Gasps filled the room as the jet came into view through the tall windows. Sharp angles, gray steel, unmistakably government-issued. Phones came out, people pointing, whispering, turning toward the double doors at the back. The engine noise softened just enough to make room for what followed. A pair of boots is hitting the pavement outside. Then the doors swung open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, hat tucked under his arm, expression unreadable. "Brigadier Monroe," he called, voice clear and cutting through the stunned silence. "You're requested for immediate transport. Priority red." Every head turned. People shifted in their seats. A few whispered my name, finally seeing what they had spent years pretending not to. I stood without rushing, folded my coat neatly across the back of the pew, and stepped into the aisle. The officer snapped to attention as I approached, offering a crisp salute. Somewhere near the front, I saw my mother's face freeze. My father's jaw tensed. A woman near them dropped her program. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one arriving unnoticed. I wasn't the quiet one in the back row. I was the headline they hadn't written, and they didn't know what to do with that. The jet's roar still echoed in the rafters as I walked down the aisle. People parted like water, unsure whether to step aside or stare. No one spoke, but their eyes shouted what their mouths couldn't catch up to. At the front, my father stood slowly, like his body had to catch up to the reality unfolding. My mother blinked hard, her mouth slightly open, a smile halfway formed and quickly swallowed. The officer held the door for me. Before stepping out, I turned just enough to meet their eyes. I gave no smile, no nod, just let the silence do what words never could. Outside, the air smelled of jet fuel and grass scorched by heat. A black SUV had pulled up near the chapel steps, and beside it, a man with a press badge lifted his camera and snapped 3 quick photos. I didn't flinch. Neither did the officer. But behind me, I heard murmurs start to bubble, curious questions, half-recognized titles, and one hushed voice says, "Is that?" The photographer stepped closer, clearly tipped off by someone. Maybe he'd been sent to cover the funeral of a local businessman and stumbled onto something bigger. I saw the moment he realized I was the story now. My boots clicked against the concrete as I crossed to the car. The door opened. I paused for one last look at the chapel. They were still frozen in place, my parents surrounded by whispers that weren't scripted. It was the first time I'd ever seen them unsure of their role, and I carried that image with me as I climbed into the vehicle. Quietly, proudly, finally seen, but on my terms. The alert came through a routine audit. A line item in my pension summary didn't match the monthly deposit. It was small, almost forgettable, but something about it felt off. I pulled the reports, cross-referenced years of statements, signatures, and benefit transfers. One document had my digital ID, but not my authorization stamp. That wasn't possible. I never signed it. The date listed was during my last deployment, when I was off-grid in northern Syria with no access to secure systems. I kept digging, request after request. Some were buried under civilian proxy permissions I'd never granted. One flagged entry had a power of attorney document attached with my name and a signature I recognized but not as mine. It was clean, almost too clean. No pressure inconsistencies, no pen drag, digitally rendered, not handwritten. I traced the access log. It originated from a residential IP in upstate New York, pinged off a home network labeled Monroe, guest. That's when my stomach dropped. There was only one Monroe household with access to my personal identifiers. My parents' home, the one my mother still lived in. I requested full beneficiary records from the DoD pension system. The next day, a sealed file arrived with one name highlighted in yellow. Secondary access is listed under all three flagged accounts. Margaret L. Monroe, my mother. I stared at the screen, jaw locked, trying to process what that meant. Either she knew what she was doing, or someone used her name too. Either way, the betrayal came from inside the circle. I called the audit office, asked for any communication records tied to the flagged forms. They forwarded a transcript of a fax sent in 2019. It authorized emergency disbursements due to family medical hardship. The listed contact was a landline I hadn't used in a decade. The signature block was mine, but again, perfectly smooth, too perfect. I called in a favor from an old JAG contact. She ran a forensic scan on the file. Within hours, she called back. "It's a forgery," she said. "Whoever did this had access to your full credential set. Not just ID, but biometric templates. That kind of access doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from familiarity, from someone who thinks your name belongs to them." I sat at my desk, hands clenched around a printout of the forged signature. Betrayal didn't always scream. Sometimes it showed up in black ink on government letterhead. And this time, it wore my mother's name. I didn't call ahead. I showed up at the house I hadn't visited in 6 years, walked through the side gate, and rang the bell like a stranger. My mother answered in a robe, hair pinned, surprise flickering just long enough to register. "Rachel," she said, soft but wary, like she wasn't sure which version of me had shown up. I stepped inside without asking and placed the printouts on the kitchen table. She read them in silence, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes scanning too fast to pretend this was new information. "It wasn't what you think," she finally said, folding her arms like it gave her some kind of defense. "Then tell me what it was," I said, voice level but tight. "Because it looks like you signed my name and rerouted thousands of dollars from my account." She didn't flinch, just sighed like I was overreacting. "We were behind on the house. Your father had medical bills. Daniel's kids needed help. It was just there." "It was mine," I said. "Not yours to use, not even to consider." "You were gone," she said, eyes narrowing. "Always gone. We thought you wouldn't notice." I stared at her, stunned by the ease with which she said it. Like my absence was a reason, not an excuse. like vanishing me from the paperwork was just logistics. "You didn't even ask," I said. "Not once." "It was temporary," she said. "You were always so proud. You wouldn't have said yes." "You're right," I said. "I wouldn't have." She shrugged. "It's not like we spent it on ourselves. It went to the family." "You spent it on the family you chose to keep," I said, "while erasing the one you sent away." Her eyes flashed, but she didn't respond. That was the real wound. Not the money, not the forgery, but how simple it had been for her to justify. I left the documents on the table and walked out without another word. Some silences are earned, others are built, brick by brick, name by name. Today, mine came off her wall for good. The rotunda at the Hall of Honor was quiet, except for the sound of boots on polished tile. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long beams across the marble floor. The walls bore names etched in stone, none of them mine, until now. I stood at attention in full dress uniform, my medals aligned, my service record read aloud without exaggeration or omission, just facts. 17 deployments, 14 rescues under fire, 1 crash. No shortcuts. The officer presenting the medal had served beside me once, years ago in Kandahar. He kept his speech short, precise, for distinguished service, operational excellence, and unwavering courage under fire. Then he pinned the medal to my chest and stepped back. I didn't look for my parents. They weren't there. This moment wasn't built for them. It wasn't choreographed for family photo albums or hometown newsletters. It was for the ones who knew what it meant to survive, not just to be admired. Rows of uniforms filled the seats. Some faces familiar, others new. But every gaze is steady. Every nod meant something. These weren't people who needed to be impressed. They just needed to know you'd earned your place. When I stepped to the podium, I didn't talk about the missions, or the medals, or the months of recovery with steel in my back and silence in my phone. I said only this: I didn't come here to be seen. I came because I kept showing up, even when it cost me. There was no applause, just the kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that means you've said enough. Afterward, I walked alone through the lower corridor of Fort Caldwell, past restricted zones, past plaques, past reminders of the job and the people who gave more than I did. I paused in front of one frame. Inside was a black and white photo from Operation Iron Crest, my first mission, 5 of us in the shot. Only 2 are still alive. I placed my hand on the glass and exhaled, not from grief, from gravity. There are ceremonies you don't get to attend, one held behind your back, ones that erase you. This wasn't one of them. This was the ceremony they couldn't rewrite, a record they couldn't adjust, a moment that didn't need their approval to matter. I didn't need my name in their stories anymore. I had written my own, and for the first time in a long time, it stayed exactly where I left it. She arrived without calling. The gate guard buzzed my office and said there was a civilian visitor named Monroe, claiming family clearance. I said, "Let her in." She looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the civilian clothes. Maybe it was the weight of knowing the script she'd rehearsed wouldn't work here. She carried a manila folder like it might fix something. I didn't offer her a seat, just stood behind my desk and waited. She took a breath, then said, "I never meant for it to feel like a betrayal." I didn't answer. That word "feel" made it clear she still didn't understand. She stepped forward and placed the folder on the desk. "Everything's in there," she said. "Every transfer, every document. I've withdrawn from the accounts. Closed the access." Still no apology, just math and paperwork. She straightened her shoulders and added, "We did what we thought was necessary at the time." I opened the folder. The signatures were real this time, so was the notarization. I flipped through each page, then closed it again. "You won't be hearing from legal," I said. "But you won't be hearing from me either." She swallowed hard. "Rachel, you're still part of this family." "No," I said, voice even. I was an asset until I stopped being useful. She looked like she wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. Just that same tight smile she'd worn at Daniel's funeral. A habit more than a feeling. I slid the folder back across the desk. This stays here, you don't. She hesitated, then picked it up slowly. Is this permanent? It's overdue, I said. She turned toward the door, paused once, then kept walking. No tears. No breakdown, just distance finally made visible. When the door clicked shut, I sat down and stared at the space she'd left behind. It didn't feel empty. It felt intact. Some goodbyes don't need ceremony. They need clarity. Today, I got mine. The office was quiet. Just the hum of the overhead light and the steady click of my pen. I opened a blank folder and wrote my name at the top. Rachel Monroe. No ranks, no titles, just the name, as it always should have been, untouched, undiluted. I slipped in copies of the corrected records. One of my original oaths, one of the ceremonies. One faded photo of Echo Unit, edges worn from years in a side pocket. The ones who never asked me to prove who I was. Some names get spoken loudly, others survive in silence. Mine had lived both lives. I used to think legacy was about who remembered you, what plaques bear your name. Now I know it's about who you are when no one's looking, what you choose when no one's clapping. I've walked back into fire for people who never knew my name, and still would, because that's who I am, not because of them, in spite of them. Tonight I closed the file and placed it in a locked drawer, not to hide it, to keep it. What matters now isn't that they forgot me. It's that I never did. I carried myself all the way here, scar by scar, step by step. And in doing that, I reclaimed something no one can forge. My name, my story, mine.